Have you ever stood in the middle of the Arizona desert and stared at a 50,000-gallon glacier? I don't mean a slushy. I don't mean a thin layer of winter frost that you can poke your finger through. I mean a literal, solid, uncompromising block of deep blue ice, so thick and so fundamentally frozen that it looked like something you would find drifting off the coast of Antarctica. Because that is exactly what I was looking at. It was the second week of July in Scottsdale, Arizona. The local meteorologists had been throwing around phrases like historic heat dome and unprecedented thermal event for the past 10 days. But out here on the asphalt, it just felt like the sun was actively trying to murder us. The ambient temperature was hovering right around a breezy 115 degrees. The air was so dry and so hot that every time you inhaled, it felt like you were breathing in the exhaust from an industrial hairdryer. If you parked your car in the driveway without a sunshade, the steering wheel became a branding iron within 20 minutes. Birds were hiding. Lizards were staying underground. The entire city was essentially on life support, sustained only by the low, continuous hum of 1 million air conditioning units, fighting a desperate, losing war against the sky. And yet, in the dead center of the sun-kissed Meadows Community Amenity Center, I was standing in a full, heavy-duty, goose-down winter parka. I had the hood pulled up. I was wearing thick wool socks inside my boots, and I was holding a stainless steel thermos filled with steaming hot cocoa. I could actually see my own breath pluming out into the blistering desert air, only for it to instantly vaporize in the heat. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cocoa, letting the melted marshmallows coat my tongue, and I watched Officer Martinez sweat. Officer Martinez was a young guy, maybe 5 years on the force, and his dark blue tactical uniform was currently betraying him. Large, dark patches of sweat were blooming under his arms and down the center of his back. He had his thumbs hooked into his utility belt, and he was rocking back and forth on his heels, just completely mesmerized by the frozen wasteland that used to be the community pool. A few feet away from us, the two Jenkins boys, a pair of absolute 10-year-old terrors who usually spent their afternoons doing cannonballs and screaming at the top of their lungs, were currently conducting a scientific experiment. One of them had found a jagged chunk of concrete from a nearby landscaping planter. He hoisted it over his head, grunted with effort, and hurled it as hard as he could into the deep end of the pool. The concrete hit the ice with a sharp, resonant crack that echoed off the stucco walls of the clubhouse. It didn't even chip the surface. The rock just bounced, skittered across the smooth blue expanse, and came to a rest near the frozen stainless steel pool ladder. Officer Martinez slowly reached up, took off his polarized aviator sunglasses, and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his tactical glove. He blinked rapidly, as if resetting his own optical nerves, before turning to look at me. "So?" Martinez started, his voice cracking just a fraction of an inch. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Let me make sure I am getting this entirely straight, Jack. You are looking me in the eye, and you are telling me that your air conditioner did this?" "Correction, Officer Martinez," I said, my voice completely level, my tone dripping with manufactured innocence. I took another loud, obnoxious slurp from my thermos. My liquid temperature regulation device experienced a slight, albeit unfortunate, thermal anomaly, while I was diligently fulfilling my Section 9 obligations to assist in the circulation of the community water feature. It is a mechanical issue, really. A tragedy of industrial efficiency. To my immediate left, Brenda was vibrating. Brenda was the president of the Sun-Kissed Meadows Homeowners Association. She was a woman in her late 50s who treated the community covenants, conditions, and restrictions like they were the sacred texts of an ancient, vindictive religion. She was wearing her standard uniform, a crisp white tennis skirt, a pastel pink polo shirt, and that ridiculous semi-translucent pink visor that cast a permanent, angry shadow over her eyes. Usually, Brenda's face was a mask of smug, bureaucratic superiority. Today, however, her face was the exact color of a violently ripe plum. The veins in her neck were bulging against her skin, pulsing in time with her elevated heart rate. She was clutching a plastic clipboard to her chest so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. "He did this on purpose!" Brenda shrieked, her voice pitching up into a frequency that I'm pretty sure only the neighborhood dogs could fully appreciate. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at the center of my chest. "It is eco-terrorism, Martinez! It's vandalism! He deliberately froze the pool! Look at it! He broke the community water! Arrest him! Put him in handcuffs right now!" I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled. A slow, warm, terrifyingly legal smile. Because Brenda had absolutely no idea the sheer magnitude of the trap she had walked into. To understand how I managed to accidentally plunge a Scottsdale subdivision into the next ice age, we have to rewind the clock exactly 3 weeks. We have to go back to the day my central air conditioning compressor decided to violently and dramatically end its own life. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2:14 p.m., to be exact. I work from home as an independent logistics consultant, which basically means I spend 8 hours a day staring at spreadsheets and yelling at freight brokers over Zoom. My home office is situated in the front room of my house, featuring a large, beautiful bay window that acts as a magnifying glass for the afternoon sun. But it was fine. My house was a comfortable, aggressively regulated 72 degrees. My central AC unit, a massive 5-ton condenser sitting on a concrete pad in my backyard, was chugging away, dutifully pumping Arctic air through my overhead vents. I was right in the middle of a tense negotiation regarding a delayed shipment of ball bearings when I heard the noise. It didn't sound like a mechanical failure. It sounded like a car crash happening inside my backyard. There was a violent, grinding crunch of metal shearing against metal, followed immediately by a high-pitched, screeching wail that actually made the drywall in my office vibrate. I froze, my hand hovering over my mouse. The screeching sound lasted for exactly 3 seconds before terminating in a dull, heavy thud. And then, the most terrifying sound you can hear during an Arizona summer. Absolute silence. The soft, rushing sound of cold air coming from the ceiling vent above my desk completely stopped. I sat there in the quiet room, blinking, waiting for the system to reboot, waiting for the compressor to kick back on. 10 seconds passed. 30 seconds. A minute. I muttered an apology to the freight broker, muted my microphone, and practically sprinted through my house to the sliding glass door in the kitchen. I stepped out onto the back patio, the blinding heat instantly wrapping around me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I walked over to the concrete pad on the side of the house. The compressor was dead. It wasn't just dead. It had actively immolated itself. A thin, pathetic wisp of black smoke was curling up from the fan grate on top of the metal housing. The entire unit smelled like burning plastic, fried copper wire, and expensive regret. I placed my hand on the metal casing and immediately yanked it back. It was hot enough to fry an egg. I didn't even bother opening the service panel. I pulled out my phone and immediately dialed the number for Desert Chill HVAC Solutions, a local company I had used a few times for routine maintenance. The phone rang 6 times before a dispatcher finally picked up. "Desert Chill, this is Gary. How can I direct your call?" Gary sounded exhausted. He sounded like a man who had been fielding calls from desperate, sweating people for 12 hours straight. "Gary, it's Jack over in sun-kissed Meadows," I said, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. "My condenser just detonated. Like smoke pouring out of the top, metal on metal grinding, complete failure. I need someone out here today." Gary let out a long, slow sigh. It was the sigh of a man delivering a death sentence. "Yeah, buddy, that sounds like the compressor blew a piston right through the casing. It's a total loss. I can get a tech out to look at it, but if it's what you're describing, you need a full replacement." "Fine, whatever," I said, wiping a bead of sweat from my upper lip. "Replace it. How soon can you get a new unit installed? Tomorrow? Thursday?" Gary actually laughed. A dry, humorless chuckle. "Thursday? Jack, it's July in Scottsdale. We are in the middle of a historic heat wave. Every supply house in a 300-mile radius is stripped bare. My guys are running 20-hour shifts just doing freon recharges and swapping capacitors. If you need a whole new 5-ton condenser, I have to order it from the manufacturer in Texas. Best case scenario, I can pencil you in for an installation on August 14th. I stared at the smoking metal box in my yard. I tried to process the words he was saying. August 14th. Gary, that is a month away. It is 112 degrees outside right now. My house is already warming up. If I don't have air conditioning for a month, you aren't going to be installing a new unit. You are going to be explaining to the coroner why my house turned into a human slow cooker." "I'm sorry, man," Gary said, his voice completely devoid of empathy. "Buy a fan. Drink water. Call me if you want to lock in that August date." He hung up. I walked back inside my house. It had been less than 10 minutes since the unit died, and the internal temperature of my house had already climbed from 72 to 78 degrees. The Arizona sun was beating down on my roof, radiating heat through the attic insulation like a broiler element in an oven. I had to act immediately. I couldn't survive in this house for 24 hours, let alone 30 days. I grabbed my wallet, my car keys, and bolted out the front door. My car, a dark gray sedan that had been baking in the driveway all morning, was a literal sauna. I opened the door, and a wave of superheated air punched me in the face. I threw myself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and blasted the dashboard vents, praying for the AC to kick in. It took 5 agonizing minutes of driving down the melted asphalt streets of Scottsdale before the car finally started blowing tepid, slightly less hot air. I drove like an absolute maniac to the nearest Home Depot. I didn't care about traffic laws. I cared about survival. I sprinted through the automatic sliding doors, relishing the blast of commercial air conditioning that hit my face, and made a beeline for the seasonal appliance aisle. I wasn't the only one with this idea. The aisle was packed with desperate, sweaty homeowners, all staring at a rapidly dwindling pallet of portable cooling units. I elbowed my way to the front of the pack. The sleek, quiet, modern portable units that sit on the floor and vent through a tiny hose were all completely sold out. There were no box fans left. There were no tower fans. The only things left were on the very bottom shelf. 3 massive, heavily reinforced, brutally industrial-looking window air conditioning units. These weren't the sleek, little modern things you see in dorm rooms. These were 12,000 BTU, heavy-duty monsters designed to cool a workshop. They looked like they were built in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. They were beige, they were covered in sharp metal grills, and they weighed roughly 80 pounds each. I grabbed the thick plastic strapping wrapped around the nearest box, hoisted it off the shelf with a grunt of exertion, and wrestled it into a flatbed shopping cart. The price tag on the shelf said $399. I would have paid $4,000. I sped through the self-checkout, hauled the massive cardboard box out to my car, and somehow managed to cram it into my back seat. By the time I got back to sun-kissed meadows, the interior of my house had reached an agonizing 88 degrees. The air inside felt thick, stagnant, and heavy. It was difficult to take a deep breath. I dragged the box up the carpeted stairs to my master bedroom. The master bedroom was the only logical choice. It was the room I slept in, and I needed to ensure I had one sanctuary in the house where I wouldn't spontaneously combust. Unfortunately, the master bedroom featured 2 large, double-hung windows that faced directly out toward the front street of the neighborhood. I didn't care. I ripped the cardboard box to shreds with a pocket knife, exposing the beige metallic monstrosity within. I opened the window, lifted the 80-pound unit, and slammed it down onto the sill. It was an awkward, precarious fit. I spent the next hour performing aggressive, unhinged DIY modifications. I used half a roll of silver duct tape to seal the gaps around the machine. I cut strips of the cardboard box and jammed them into the side panels to block the outside air. It looked absolutely atrocious. It looked like a meth lab barricade in a post-apocalyptic survival compound. I stepped back, panting, sweating through my t-shirt, and plugged the thick three-pronged power cord into the wall outlet. I reached out and turned the mechanical dial all the way to maximum cooling. The machine violently rumbled to life. The compressor engaged with a loud, aggressive thunk, and a second later, a blast of aggressively cold, beautifully sharp air shot out of the plastic vents and hit me right in the chest. It was the loudest appliance I had ever heard in my life. It hummed and rattled like a small jet engine idling on a tarmac. But the air was freezing. I shut my bedroom door, sealing the room off from the rest of the boiling house. I stripped down to my underwear, dragged a chair right in front of the unit, and just sat there for 3 hours, letting the frigid air wash over my overheated body. By 8 p.m., my bedroom was a glorious, shivering 65 degrees. The rest of my house was sitting at 95 degrees. My candles were literally bending over sideways on the kitchen counter like they were depressed, and my houseplants were actively wilting. But I didn't care. I had a lifeboat. I crawled into bed that night, pulled the heavy comforter up to my chin, let the roar of the window unit drown out my thoughts, and I slept the deep, unbroken sleep of a man who had conquered nature. I was safe. I was cool. I had survived the apocalypse. My victory lasted for exactly 22 hours. The knock on my front door came at 10:15 a.m. the following morning. It wasn't a polite, casual knock. It was a sharp, rapid, aggressive pounding, the kind of rhythmic, authoritative knocking that screams, "I have a clipboard, I have a terrible haircut, and I am here to ruin your day. Open up!" I groaned, dragging myself out of my freezing bedroom oasis. I opened my bedroom door and was instantly assaulted by a wall of 90-degree heat that had settled in the upstairs hallway. I slowly trudged down the stairs, sweat already beginning to prickle on my forehead, and walked to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open, bracing myself for the blast of outside heat. Standing on my front porch, bathed in the blinding morning sun, was Brenda. She had her pastel pink visor pulled down low. She was holding a bright orange plastic clipboard tightly against her chest, and she was staring at me with a mixture of absolute disgust and unbridled, bureaucratic joy. She lived for these moments. This was her Super Bowl. "Good morning, Jack," Brenda said. Her voice dripped with a fake, sugary sweetness that was so incredibly patronizing it almost made my teeth hurt. "Brenda," I replied, leaning heavily against the doorframe, trying not to let the 100-degree exterior air rush into my house. "What can I do for you this morning?" "Oh, it's not what you can do for me, Jack. It's what you can do for the aesthetic integrity of the entire community," she said, her eyes slowly, deliberately darting up to my second-story master bedroom window. I was conducting my scheduled Thursday morning perimeter patrol, ensuring that our beautiful neighborhood is adhering to the standards we all agreed upon, and I couldn't help but notice a very unsightly, unauthorized modification to the exterior elevation of your property. I didn't even have to look up. I knew exactly what she was looking at. The beige Soviet-era cooling box wrapped in silver duct tape and cardboard. "My central AC compressor blew up yesterday, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice as calm and reasonable as possible. "It's a complete total loss. I called the HVAC company. They can't get a replacement condenser out here for a month because of the supply chain backup. It is a temporary window unit so I can sleep without dying." "Oh, I see," Brenda said, tapping a perfectly manicured acrylic nail against the edge of her clipboard. "Tap, tap, tap. Well, that is very unfortunate for you, Jack. Truly, my heart bleeds. But as you are well aware, when you purchased a home in sun-kissed meadows, you signed a legally binding contract agreeing to abide by the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And under Section 4.2.1, window-mounted air conditioning units are strictly, unequivocally prohibited from being visible from the street-facing elevation. "Brenda, look at me," I said, gesturing to my already sweating face. "It is going to be 115 degrees today. If I take that unit out of the window, I will literally cook to death in my own bedroom. It's a medical necessity at this point." "Rules are rules, Jack," Brenda snapped, dropping the sugary facade. Her eyes narrowed into angry little slits. "We cannot just have people sticking loud, ugly appliances out of their windows like we live in some kind of low-income tenement housing. What's next? Hanging your wet laundry on a clothesline across the driveway? Keeping chickens in the front yard? Painting your garage door neon green? It ruins the property values. It sets a terrible precedent. It is a metal box that blows cold air, Brenda. It is not a meth lab." She ignored me. She reached into her little canvas tote bag and dramatically pulled it out. The violation notice. And she hadn't just printed it out. She had printed it on bright, neon pink paper, and she had literally taken the time to run it through a thermal laminator. She had laminated a fine just so it would have a nice, crisp, authoritative weight to it when she shoved it into my chest. "This is your official first warning and notice of violation," Brenda said, thrusting the glossy pink rectangle into my hands. "You have exactly 24 hours to remove the unauthorized appliance and restore the window to its original state. If the unit is not removed by 10:15 a.m. tomorrow morning, you will be formally assessed a non-negotiable fine of $500 per day, every single day until compliance is met. Furthermore, failure to pay the fines will result in a lien being placed upon your property. Have a truly blessed day, Jack." She didn't even wait for me to respond. She spun on her heel, her white tennis skirt flaring out, and marched aggressively down my driveway, making a check mark on her clipboard with a red pen. She looked like she had just cured a terminal disease. I stood there in the doorway, the oppressive heat baking my skin, holding the glossy, plastic-coated piece of paper. $500 a day. My brain did the math instantly. That was $3,500 a week. That was $15,000 a month. I make decent money as a logistics consultant, but I absolutely do not pay an HOA 15 grand to keep my bedroom cold money. I couldn't afford that fine. More importantly, I couldn't fight her on the fundamental facts of the violation. She had me dead to rights on the visual aspect. The AC was a window unit. It was visible from the street. It was hideous. If I tried to take it to the HOA board, they would side with her immediately. I closed the front door, locked the deadbolt, and walked slowly up the stairs. The heat in the hallway was already stifling. I opened my bedroom door and stood in the blast of the freezing air. I walked over to the machine. I put my face right up to the plastic vent, closed my eyes, and breathed in the frost for one last glorious minute. Then, with a heavy, sinking heart, I reached down and pulled the heavy plug out of the wall. The roaring hum of the compressor died instantly. The silence in the room was deafening. I grabbed the edge of the silver duct tape and aggressively ripped it off the drywall, taking a strip of white paint with it. I didn't care. I pulled the cardboard out, grabbed the heavy metal chassis of the machine, and yanked it out of the window frame, slamming it down onto the carpeted floor. I slammed the double-hung window shut and locked it. Within 20 minutes, the residual cold air dissipated, and the brutal, inescapable Arizona sun began baking the room once again. I spent the next 2 days living in a state of agonizing, borderline hallucinatory suffering. I drove to a local pharmacy and managed to find 3 cheap plastic box fans. I set them up in my living room, pointing them directly at the couch in a triangle formation. They didn't cool the air. They just aggressively moved 95-degree air across my sweating body, like a dog panting hot garbage breath directly into my face. The heat changed the fundamental reality of my house. My couch cushions felt constantly damp. The hardwood floors radiated warmth. When I turned on the cold water tap in the kitchen, the water came out lukewarm because the pipes running through the foundation were heated by the earth. I was eating bowls of ice cubes for dinner because the thought of turning on the stove made me want to throw up. I sat on my couch in my underwear, dripping sweat onto the upholstery, slowly losing my grip on my own sanity. On the third night of the heat wave, the internal temperature of my house hit 98 degrees. I couldn't sleep. My brain was vibrating. I was so incredibly angry, so deeply filled with a petty, consuming rage toward Brenda and her laminated pink slip that I couldn't just sit there and take it. At 2 a.m., dehydrated and delirious, I walked into my home office. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out the Sun-Kissed Meadows Homeowners Association Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions Rulebook. It was a massive, 3-inch thick, 300-page black binder of absolute tyranny. It was the weapon Brenda used to terrorize the neighborhood, but I wasn't reading it to find comfort. I wasn't reading it to find a way to apologize. I was reading it because I wanted to find a sword of my own. If Brenda wanted to play by the exact, literal letter of the law, then we were going to play by the exact, literal letter of the law. I sat down at my desk, wiped a stream of sweat out of my stinging eyes, and opened the binder to page 1. I read for 3 hours. I read pages and pages of the most insane, hyper-specific regulations you could possibly imagine. I read the section that dictated that all exterior house paint must have a light reflectance value of no more than 40%. I read the clause that mandated that front yard Bermuda grass could not exceed 2.5 inches in length during the summer months. I read a 4-page addendum on the exact legally permissible shade of beige allowed for garbage cans. Finally, around 4:30 a.m., my eyes bloodshot and my shirt soaked through, I found the section I was looking for. Article 4. Exterior Modifications and Appliances. Section 4.2. 1. Air conditioning units. No window-mounted air conditioning units, evaporative coolers, or swamp coolers are permitted to be installed in any window visible from the street-facing elevation. Furthermore, no freestanding portable air conditioning units venting forced exhaust through window panels are permitted on the property at any time. I stared at the words. Very specific, very thorough. They banned air conditioners that went in windows, and they banned air conditioners that vented out of windows. But my logistics brain, honed by years of analyzing shipping contracts for legal loopholes, started spinning. What is the legal, mechanical definition of an air conditioner? An AC unit is a machine that uses an electrical compressor to push a chemical refrigerant gas, like Freon, through a copper evaporator coil, while simultaneously using a motorized fan to blow forced air over that coil to cool a designated space. That is an air conditioner. I started rapidly flipping through the rest of the binder, scanning the headers. I needed to see what was allowed. I bypassed the roofing tile regulations. I bypassed the driveway paving material mandates. And then, on page 112, under the section regarding backyard landscaping, I found it. Section 8.4. Exterior pool and water feature equipment. Standard pool maintenance equipment, filtration pumps, and exterior liquid temperature regulation devices are permitted on the property, provided they are strictly ground-mounted and completely obscured from public view by a standard wooden privacy screen, no less than 4 feet in height. I blinked. I leaned closer to the desk lamp, tracing the sentence with my finger. Exterior liquid temperature regulation devices are permitted. It didn't say pool heaters. It didn't specify heating versus cooling. It just said liquid temperature regulation devices. And it didn't put a cap on the size, the commercial grade, or the thermal output. My heart started beating a little faster. I flipped the page, following the chain of pool-related regulations. Section 9. Community amenity integration and easements. Properties immediately abutting the community amenity center, the pool and clubhouse lot, must maintain and not obstruct any shared utility lines, drainage lines, or water circulation bypass lines present on their deeded lot. Furthermore, residents abutting the Community Amenity Center must assist in the circulation of community water features if a shared bypass line is physically present and accessible on their property. I sat back in my desk chair. The leather stuck to my sweaty back, but I didn't care. My property backed right up to the community pool. A 6-foot cinder block wall was the only thing separating my backyard from the HOA pool deck, and I knew, with absolute certainty, because I had dug up the dirt to plant a row of agave cacti 2 years ago, that there was an old capped-off 4-inch PVC pipe sticking out of the ground right near my fence line. It was a shared circulation bypass line, a relic from 20 years ago when the neighborhood was first being constructed, and the original developers had planned to run the massive community pool's heating system through the residential gas lines before the city zoning board shut the idea down. The pipe was just sitting there, dead, but connected directly to the 50,000-gallon pool system. All the pieces suddenly clicked together in my head. It was a flawless, legally binding puzzle. They banned window air conditioners. They explicitly permitted ground-mounted liquid temperature regulation devices behind a fence. They legally mandated that I assist in circulating the pool water if I hooked into that specific bypass line. A slow, manic, sleep-deprived grin spread across my face in the dark, sweltering office. I didn't need to buy a new air conditioner. I didn't need to fight Brenda on the window rule. I needed a chiller. The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., I walked out of my house and marched down the melting sidewalk toward the community clubhouse. Brenda was sitting behind the mahogany front desk in the air-conditioned lobby, sipping a massive iced coffee through a green plastic straw. She looked up as the automatic doors slid open, and when she saw me, a triumphant, condescending smirk spread across her face. "Well, well," Brenda practically purred, setting her coffee down. "Good morning, Jack. You look a little flushed. Did you finally come to your senses and take that hideous eyesore out of your window?" "I did, Brenda," I said, my voice perfectly calm and polite. I walked up to her desk. I took it down immediately. "You were absolutely right. Rules are rules, and we have to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood." She beamed. She literally puffed her chest out with pride. "I am so glad you understand, Jack. It's for the good of the community. We all have to make sacrifices." "Absolutely," I agreed, reaching into my back pocket and pulling out my checkbook. "However, I am here to formally pay the one-day fine of $500, as the unit was technically in the window for 24 hours after the issuance of your laminated notice. I believe in being completely 100% compliant with the ledger." I scribbled out a check for $500, ripped it out, and slid it across the polished wood desk. Brenda looked at the check suspiciously. Her eyes darted up to my face. People did not smile when they handed Brenda $500. People usually screamed, cried, or threatened to key her car. "And," I continued, smoothly reaching into my folder and pulling out a single sheet of paper, "while I am here, I wanted to formally submit an expedited architectural modification request. I am going to be installing a small wooden privacy screen in my backyard, exactly 4 feet tall, fully compliant with Section 8.4 regarding exterior equipment." "A privacy screen?" Brenda narrowed her eyes behind her visor. "For what? You don't have a pool." "For a water feature," I lied effortlessly, leaning my elbows on the desk. "Well, legally, the paperwork classifies it as an exterior liquid temperature regulation device. I've decided to invest heavily in some high-end backyard landscaping. Koi pond, fountains, the works. Gotta keep the water cool, you know? The Arizona heat just boils standing water features. Don't want dead fish." Brenda scoffed, rolling her eyes. She snatched the architectural approval form from my hand and quickly scanned it. "As long as it's ground-mounted behind a 4-foot screen, and it is absolutely not an air conditioning condenser, I do not care what kind of stupid, overpriced fountain you build in your backyard. Approved." She picked up her heavy red rubber stamp, pressed it into the ink pad, and slammed it down onto my application. Approved. Chorboard President. Thanks, Brenda, I smiled, carefully folding the carbon copy and sliding it into my pocket. I really, truly appreciate your unwavering dedication to following the rules exactly as they are written. I turned and walked out of the clubhouse lobby. The blistering heat instantly assaulted me as the doors opened, but I didn't care. The sweat on my neck felt like a victory lap. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened the Safari browser, and navigated directly to a heavy industrial surplus auction website. I didn't need a fountain pump. I needed a monster. I searched for commercial hydronic glycol chiller. Now, if you have never been on a heavy industrial surplus website, it is a completely different world. You aren't browsing for sleek, consumer-friendly appliances with Energy Star ratings and Wi-Fi connectivity. You are browsing for massive utilitarian behemoths built out of galvanized steel and exposed copper. These are machines designed for continuous, brutal operation. They are meant for commercial breweries. They are meant for injection molding plastics factories that need to rapidly cool molten polymers. They are meant for industrial dairy farms that need to flash cool thousands of gallons of raw milk from a cow's body temperature down to 34 degrees in a matter of seconds before it spoils. I scrolled past a dozen smaller units before I found the one. It was listed by a liquidator handling the bankruptcy assets of a massive commercial dairy operation just outside of Amarillo, Texas. It was a custom-built, dual-compressor, 20-ton agricultural chiller. To put that number into perspective for you, a standard, large, 2-story residential home in Arizona typically requires a 3-ton air conditioning unit to keep the inside comfortable. Maybe a 4-ton unit if you have vaulted ceilings. This machine was 20 tons. It was the absolute, undeniable nuclear option of temperature control. It was roughly the size of a Honda Odyssey minivan. It weighed 2,400 pounds dry. And most importantly, because of the way it was engineered, it did not use a standard forced air Freon evaporator coil. It pumped a specialized non-toxic antifreeze liquid, propylene glycol, through a massive, self-contained refrigeration loop, dropping the liquid to sub-zero temperatures. You could then pipe that freezing liquid through a secondary heat exchanger to cool absolutely anything you wanted. Legally, according to the exact definitions laid out in the United States Patent Office and, more importantly, the Sun-Kissed Meadows HOA rulebook, it was not an air conditioner. It was an exterior liquid temperature regulation device. It was exactly what Brenda had just stamped her name on. The buy-it-now price was $6,200. I didn't even hesitate. I typed in my credit card number, selected the expedited commercial freight shipping option, and hit confirm. I was going to be eating ramen noodles for the next 3 months to pay off the credit card bill, but honestly, I did not care. You cannot put a price tag on spite. The next 4 days were a blur of absolute, unmitigated physical suffering. The heat wave over Scottsdale did not break. It intensified. The local news stations were showing footage of people baking cookies on the dashboards of their cars. My house was a stagnant, heavy oven. I completely abandoned my bedroom. I dragged a bare mattress down to the ground floor and placed it directly over the ceramic tile in the kitchen, hoping the floor foundation would leach some of the heat out of my body. I slept in front of the open refrigerator door for 20 minutes at a time, before the compressor alarm beeped and forced me to shut it. I was drinking 2 gallons of ice water a day, and still felt like beef jerky. But on Friday morning, my salvation arrived. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sweating onto my laptop keyboard, when I heard the loud, unmistakable hiss of heavy air brakes out on the street. I looked out the front window. A massive 18-wheeler flatbed truck, the kind usually reserved for hauling construction cranes and steel girders, was idling in front of my driveway. I threw open the front door and ran outside. The driver, a guy with a thick beard and a faded mesh trucker hat, was already unstrapping heavy yellow ratchet straps from a massive steel-caged cube sitting on the bed of the trailer. "You, Jack?" the driver yelled over the roar of the idling diesel engine. "That's me," I yelled back, practically vibrating with excitement. "Where do you want it, buddy? I got a motorized pallet jack, but I ain't taking this thing over any soft grass." "Right up the driveway, through the side RV gate, and onto the concrete pad in the backyard," I instructed, pointing to the double-wide wooden gate on the side of my house. The driver lowered the hydraulic lift gate. The sheer weight of the chiller made the entire trailer groan and shift as he rolled it off. The machine was intimidating. It was completely encased in a heavy-duty, weather-proof steel cage, dotted with high-voltage warning stickers and massive industrial pressure gauges. 2 exhaust fans, each the size of a tractor tire, sat mounted on the top chassis. It looked less like an appliance and more like a piece of equipment you would use to terraform a harsh alien planet. As the driver was maneuvering the 2,000-pound beast up my driveway, the front door of the house across the street slowly opened. It was Susan, one of the neighborhood gossips. She stepped out onto her porch in her bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee, and just stared in absolute, slack-jawed bewilderment at the monolithic machine invading the quiet, beige aesthetics of sun-kissed meadows. I just gave her a friendly, enthusiastic wave. She slowly backed into her house and shut the door. Once the machine was sitting squarely on the concrete pad in my backyard, I signed the freight manifest, tipped the driver $50, and immediately got on the phone. I had prearranged the installation with a local commercial pipe fitting and HVAC outfit. I didn't call Desert Chill back. I needed guys who understood industrial-grade heavy machinery. I needed guys who wouldn't ask too many moral questions. An hour later, a beaten-up white Ford F-250 utility truck rumbled into my driveway. The side of the truck read Apex Commercial Mechanical Services. 2 guys stepped out. Mike was the older of the 2, built like a fire hydrant with a thick gray mustache and a tool belt that looked like it weighed 40 pounds. Dave was younger, tall and wire-thin, chewing on a toothpick and carrying a massive spool of insulated copper wire over his shoulder. They walked through the side gate into the backyard. I was standing next to the chiller, hands on my hips, grinning like an idiot. Mike stopped walking. He slowly pushed his hard hat back on his head and stared at the machine. He looked at the machine, then he looked at my standard, 2-story, stucco-clad suburban house, and then he looked back at the machine. "Buddy," Mike said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. What exactly are you trying to do here? Are you secretly running a server farm in your basement? Are you opening a wholesale meatpacking plant in your guest room?" "No, Mike," I said, wiping a fresh layer of sweat off my forehead. "I'm just trying to cool my house down. My central unit blew out." Dave let out a loud, barking laugh, nearly dropping the spool of wire. "With a 20-ton, dual-stage dairy chiller? Bro, you turn this thing on full blast, your living room is going to precipitate snow. You're going to have actual, literal penguins nesting in your kitchen cabinets." "Dave," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "if I do not require a heavy, goose-down winter coat to watch television in my own living room in the middle of July, you haven't done your job properly." Mike just shook his head, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mustache. "Hey, man, your money, your frostbite. Let's get to work." They were completely, fundamentally bewildered, but they charged $150 an hour, so they weren't about to argue with a crazy guy who wanted to turn his house into a meat locker. The installation was an absolute logistical nightmare, but Mike and Dave were artists. They started by running a massive, dedicated 200-amp electrical sub-panel directly from my main breaker box just to power the beast. Then, they had to run the actual liquid lines. Since we couldn't use the existing tiny copper Freon lines that my old AC used, they had to run 2-inch thick, heavily insulated PX piping from the chiller in the backyard straight up the side of my house. To keep Brenda off my back regarding exterior aesthetics, I had purchased a hollow aluminum architectural faux gutter. We hid the massive pipes completely inside the fake downspout, running it all the way up into the attic vents. Inside the attic, the real surgery happened. The attic was easily 130 degrees. Mike and Dave were taking shifts, coming down every 20 minutes to chug ice water so they didn't pass out. They cut a massive hole in my main central ductwork plenum and installed a commercial-grade hydronic heat exchanger coil. It looked like a car radiator on steroids. The concept was beautifully simple. The chiller outside would pump sub-zero glycol up the pipes and through the massive coil in the attic. My existing indoor blower fan would then kick on, forcing the hot air of the house across the freezing coil, instantly chilling the air before it blasted out of my ceiling vents. By 4 p.m., they were almost done. The pipes were run. The electrical was wired. They were pumping the specialized propylene glycol antifreeze into the chiller's massive reservoir tank. I was standing in the backyard, watching Mike tighten the final bolts on the pressure manifold when Dave came climbing down the ladder from the attic. His face was covered in a layer of gray fiberglass dust and sweat. He did not look happy. "Hey, Jack," Dave said, wiping his face with a dirty rag. "We have a serious problem." My stomach immediately dropped. "What? Did the coil not fit in the ductwork?" "No, the coil is fine. The blower is fine. The problem is thermal displacement," Dave said, walking over to the machine and tapping the heavy steel casing with his knuckles. This machine is designed to cool vats of boiling liquid down to freezing in minutes. It has a massive, absolutely insane cooling capacity. Your house? Your house is nothing to this machine. It's like using a fire hose to fill up a shot glass. "Okay," I said slowly. "Isn't that a good thing? It means it will cool the house instantly." "Yes, but it's a mechanical disaster," Mike chimed in, stepping back from the manifold. "If this massive compressor kicks on, it's going to hit its target temperature in the house in like 10 minutes. Then it's going to shut off. Then 10 minutes later, it'll kick back on. It's called short cycling. If a 20-ton commercial compressor short cycles, the internal pressure will build up, the motor will overheat, and the entire unit will literally tear itself apart from the inside out within a week. The manual explicitly states that this unit requires a continuous, heavy thermal load to operate safely." Dave nodded in agreement. "To run this thing without destroying it, we need a thermal buffer. We need a massive body of liquid to run a secondary heat exchange loop through. Basically, we need somewhere to dump the excess cooling energy so the machine doesn't overpressurize and kill itself. Usually, factories use giant rooftop cooling towers. You don't have a cooling tower, Jack." I stood there in the blistering heat. I looked at the machine. I looked at Mike. I looked at Dave. And then I slowly turned my head and looked over at the 6-foot cinder block wall separating my backyard from the HOA community pool deck. A massive body of liquid. I walked over to the edge of my property line. I kicked away a pile of decorative landscaping rocks, exposing the dirt underneath. There it was. The 4-inch white PVC pipe, capped off at the top, sticking out of the ground like a beacon of absolute malicious compliance. "Dave!" I called out, gesturing for him to come over. Dave walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. He looked down at the pipe. "Dave," I said, pointing at the PVC. "Can you hook the secondary heat exchange loop into that?" Dave crouched down. He pulled a pocket knife out, scraped some dirt off the pipe, and knocked on it with the heavy plastic handle of his knife. It made a deep, hollow, resonant sound. "Yeah, I can tap into this. It's a standard high-pressure water line. But, Jack, where does this go?" Dave looked up over the cinder block wall. He could see the top of the community clubhouse and the blue umbrellas on the pool deck. He slowly looked back at me, his eyes widening. "Buddy, tell me this pipe does not go where I think it goes." Oh, it definitely goes to the 50,000-gallon community pool, I smiled. Mike walked over, crossing his massive arms. Jack, we can't tie an industrial chiller's secondary loop into a public HOA pool. That's insane. That's vandalism. They'll sue you into the Stone Age. Actually, Mike, I said, holding up a single finger, it would be illegal for me not to tie into it. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened my photo gallery, and brought up the picture I had taken of the HOA rulebook at 4 a.m. I held the screen out for Mike and Dave to read. Section 9, I read aloud, savoring every single syllable. Properties immediately abutting the community amenity center must maintain and not obstruct any shared utility lines, drainage lines, or water circulation bypass lines present on their lot. Furthermore, residents abutting the community amenity center must assist in the circulation of community water features if a shared line is physically present on their deeded property. Mike stared at the screen. He read it twice. I have a shared line physically present on my deeded property, I said innocently, throwing my hands up in the air. The HOA mandates, under penalty of fines, that I assist in the circulation of the water feature. Furthermore, as you just informed me, if I don't give this machine a massive thermal buffer to dump its exhaust energy into, the compressor will explode. If the machine explodes because I purposely altered its necessary operating parameters, I void the commercial warranty. Under the Federal Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, a local HOA bylaw cannot force a consumer to void a federally protected product warranty. Dave was staring at me like I had 3 heads. So, I concluded, if I tap into that line, I am simply fulfilling my legally mandated HOA obligations while simultaneously ensuring the mechanical integrity of my legally approved exterior liquid temperature regulation device. If my machine accidentally happens to rapidly chill the pool water while running its secondary loop, well, that is just a tragic mechanical necessity. I'm just following the rules, guys. Mike stared at me for a very, very long time. The wind rustled the dry leaves of a nearby palm tree. A drop of sweat rolled down his thick gray mustache. And then a slow, wicked, deeply appreciative grin spread across his face. You are a very sick, very twisted man, Jack, Mike whispered. I'm just a guy who likes his contracts enforced literally, I replied. Can you pipe it or not? Dave, Mike barked, turning around and walking back to the truck. Get the reciprocating saw and the heavy-duty PVC primer. We're tapping the main line. It took them another 2 hours to build the bypass manifold. They cut the cap off the 4-inch pipe, installed a massive brass diverter valve, and ran thick, braided, high-pressure hoses directly from the secondary thermal dump ports on the dairy chiller right into the pool's circulation line. It was a masterpiece of plumbing engineering. The machine would now pull a continuous stream of water from the pool, run it across the secondary heat exchanger to keep the compressor from overheating, and then blast that water right back into the pool system. While they were finishing the plumbing, I got to work on the final legal requirement. Section 8.4. The privacy screen. I had gone to the hardware store the day before and purchased 4 prefabricated wooden lattice fence panels, exactly 48 inches tall. I drove 4 metal stakes into the dirt around the concrete pad and zip-tied the wooden panels to the stakes. It looked absolutely ridiculous. It was a flimsy, cheap wooden box surrounding a 2,000-pound industrial monolith. You could clearly see the massive steel exhaust fans poking out over the top of the wood. But the rules did not say the machine had to be invisible. The rules said it had to be obscured by a standard privacy screen no less than 4 feet in height. I pulled out a tape measure, hooked it on the dirt, and measured the wood panel. 48¼ inches. Perfect. Legally flawless. Flawless malicious compliance. Because the machine was entirely self-contained. Because we weren't tapping into the city water mains or the municipal Freon lines, and because Brenda had officially classified it on paper as water feature landscaping equipment, we completely bypassed the city of Scottsdale's mandatory HVAC, permitting, and inspection requirements. By 6:30 p.m., the sun was finally starting to dip below the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the backyard. The ambient temperature was still hovering around 108 degrees. Mike and Dave packed their tools back into the utility truck. Dave wiped his hands on a greasy towel and walked over to the massive breaker box they had installed on the side of the house. "All right, buddy," Dave said, looking at the main throw switch. "The system is sealed. The glycol is primed. The secondary loop is open and circulating the pool line. Are you ready for this?" "Dave," I said, my shirt clinging to my back, my skin radiating heat. "I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life." Mike stood next to the machine, holding a digital thermometer gun. "Fire it up," I commanded. Dave grabbed the heavy plastic handle of the 200-amp breaker switch and slammed it upward with a loud mechanical clack. For a split second, nothing happened. And then, the beast awoke. It didn't sound like a normal air conditioner. It didn't have that high-pitched, whiny hum. The startup sound was a low, guttural, aggressive, industrial thrum that I could literally feel vibrating through the soles of my shoes. The twin, massive exhaust fans on top of the cage slowly began to spin, ramping up speed until they were a blur of metal, sounding like a military helicopter warming up on a landing pad. "Compressor 1 is engaged," Mike yelled over the noise, looking at the pressure gauges. "Glycol temperature is dropping, 40 degrees, 30 degrees, 20 degrees. It's holding at 15 degrees liquid temp. Go check the house," Dave yelled, pointing toward the sliding glass door. I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted across the patio, threw the sliding glass door open, and ran into my living room. I stood directly beneath the large rectangular ceiling vent in the center of the room. I closed my eyes and waited. 10 seconds later, the massive commercial blower fan in the attic kicked on. The air that shot out of that vent wasn't just cold. It was violent. It was aggressive. It was a torrential downpour of absolute, unadulterated Arctic frost. The force of the air was so strong it actually made the fabric of my t-shirt ripple. I gasped. It felt like stepping out of a sauna and immediately jumping into a snowbank. I pulled the digital meat thermometer out of the kitchen drawer, turned it on, and held it up to the ceiling vent. The digital numbers plummeted instantly. 80, 60, 50, 40. The air coming out of the vent was 38 degrees. I stood there in the living room, laughing out loud like an absolute maniac. I watched the digital thermostat on my hallway wall. The numbers were dropping in real time. It was 95 degrees when I walked in. 2 minutes later, it was 90. 5 minutes later, it was 82. In exactly 14 minutes, the massive 20-ton dairy chiller, forcefully pumping sub-zero glycol through the oversized attic heat exchanger, had dropped the temperature of my entire 2,000-square-foot house down to a crisp, perfect, shivering 60 degrees. I walked back outside to the patio. The heat hit me like a physical wall, but I didn't care anymore. I was invincible. Mike and Dave were standing by their truck, packing up the last of their gear. "Well?" Mike asked, raising an eyebrow. "Mike," I said, reaching into my wallet. "You are an artist. You are a genius of thermodynamics." I pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills and handed one to each of them. "Buy yourselves a steak dinner tonight." "Appreciate it, Jack." Dave grinned, pocketing the cash. "Just remember that secondary loop is actively dumping a massive amount of thermal energy displacement into that pool line right now. The machine is pulling the heat out of your house, but it's also over-chilling the water to keep the compressor from freezing over. I don't know how long it's going to take for that HOA pool to feel the effects, but you might want to keep an eye on it." "Oh, I intend to," I smiled. They got into their truck, gave a quick honk of the horn, and drove away. I walked back inside, shut the sliding glass door, and locked it. I went upstairs, stripped off my sweaty, disgusting clothes, and took a freezing cold shower just because I could. When I got out, the house was actually almost too cold. My teeth were practically chattering. I went to my closet, dug past my summer clothes, and pulled out a thick pair of gray fleece sweatpants and a heavy, oversized hoodie. I put them on, grabbed a heavy winter blanket off the top shelf, and walked down to the living room. I threw myself onto the couch, wrapped myself in the blanket, and grabbed the TV remote. I was sitting in the middle of the Arizona desert in the dead of July, during a historic heat wave, wearing fleece and a blanket. I had beaten the sun. I had beaten the HOA. I had won. But I didn't fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of my victory. I didn't realize that my brilliant, legally watertight, malicious compliance loophole was about to set off a chain reaction of absolute, neighborhood-destroying chaos. Because I had a scheduled trip to Las Vegas that Friday night for a buddy's bachelor party. Before I called my Uber to the airport, I walked over to the digital control panel Dave had wired into my hallway wall. I didn't want to turn the chiller off while I was gone, because if the house heated back up to 100 degrees, it would take a lot of energy to cool it back down. Furthermore, the machine was designed for continuous industrial operation. Turning it on and off rapidly was bad for the compressor. So I pressed the digital menu button. I set the machine's operational mode to continuous auto-regulate. I set the target ambient house temperature to a frosty 58 degrees, and I set the target glycol liquid baseline to 35 degrees, ensuring the house would stay permanently freezing all weekend. I grabbed my duffel bag, locked the front door, and got into my Uber, leaving the 20-ton agricultural beast humming away in the backyard. What I completely failed to consider, in my petty, spite-fueled arrogance, was the fundamental nature of the desert night cycle. During the day, the Arizona sun was a massive, relentless thermal load. The chiller was fighting against 115 degrees of radiant heat beating down on the roof of my house. It had to work hard to maintain that 58-degree interior. But at night in the desert, the sun goes away, and the ambient temperature drops significantly, plunging down into the mid-80s. Without the massive heat load of the sun bearing down on the house, my 20-ton dairy chiller suddenly had virtually zero resistance. The machine became wildly, absurdly, catastrophically over-efficient. It hit its target interior temperature of 58 degrees in a matter of minutes. But the machine was programmed for industrial continuity. It was told to keep the glycol liquid at 35 degrees, no matter what. It didn't want to shut off. It needed to keep working. The dual compressors kept firing, furiously compressing the refrigerant, generating massive amounts of mechanical energy. It desperately needed to displace that excess cooling capacity somewhere, otherwise the internal pressure would spike and blow the seals. And so, perfectly executing its programming, flawlessly following the safety protocols Dave had set up, the machine began dumping all of its massive, unchecked sub-zero excess cooling capacity straight into the secondary heat exchange loop, straight through the 4-inch PVC bypass line, straight into the 50,000-gallon sun-kissed Meadows community pool. I was literally sitting at a $5 minimum blackjack table at the Bellagio, nursing a severely overpriced gin and tonic, when my phone started vibrating in my pocket like it was trying to drill a hole through my thigh. Honestly, I usually keep the sun-kissed Meadows Neighborhood Watch group chat on permanent, indefinite mute. Mostly because it's usually just Brenda complaining about somebody leaving their green waste trash cans on the curb for an extra 45 minutes, or some guy named Greg posting incredibly blurry, out-of-focus pictures of a coyote 3 miles away, like he's a National Geographic photographer. But my phone was buzzing so hard and so consistently that it was basically interrupting the dealer's rhythm. I pulled it out, annoyed, fully expecting to see a debate about lawn care. I had 72 missed messages. The first text was from Friday night, right around 11:30 p.m. It was from Susan, the lady who lived 3 houses down from me who always wore those aggressively large sun hats. "Hey everyone, is the pool heater broken or something? I just took the kids down for a quick night swim because of the heat wave and the water is absolutely freezing. It's got to be like 60 degrees at most. Timmy's lips turned blue." Brenda replied almost immediately. Because, I am firmly convinced that woman does not actually sleep. She just hangs upside down in a heavily starched closet like a bureaucratic bat, waiting for a CC&R violation to occur. The HOA board has absolutely not authorized any changes to the pool heating schedule, Susan. I will have the maintenance contractor check the thermostat tomorrow morning. Please ensure your children dry off completely before entering the clubhouse lobby. Then came Saturday morning, 9:15 a.m. A text from Greg. Brenda? I just walked down here to dip my feet in. It's not 60 degrees, it's 45 degrees. The water is actually visibly slushing near the skimmer grates. It feels like a mountain river. Brenda, completely incapable of admitting that anything in her neighborhood could operate outside of her direct control, fired back. That is scientifically impossible, Greg. It is already 110 degrees outside today. Water does not slush in this heat. You are exaggerating. By Saturday afternoon, the chat had completely devolved into pure, unadulterated chaos. People were sending video clips. The pool, which was normally a crystal-clear, warm bathwater oasis, was turning a weird, cloudy, hyper-dense shade of deep blue. The water was getting so astronomically cold that the ambient, boiling desert humidity was instantly condensing the second it hit the surface, creating this thick, eerie layer of rolling white fog across the entire amenity center. It looked like a swamp scene from a low-budget horror movie, except it was noon in Scottsdale. Then came Sunday morning. The text that made me actually choke on my drink and laugh out loud in the middle of the casino floor. Brenda, there is a dead bird frozen on top of the water. The pool is solid ice. I knew the dairy chiller was powerful. Dave the pipe fitter had literally looked me in the eyes and warned me. But I guess I just didn't fully comprehend the sheer, aggressive, world-ending thermal displacement capabilities of a machine designed specifically to flash freeze thousands of gallons of raw milk. I had left the thermostat set to 35 degrees on continuous auto-regulate, and the machine had simply looked at the 50,000-gallon pool, cracked its metaphorical knuckles, and said, "Challenge accepted." I tipped the dealer a 20, cashed out my remaining chips, and walked straight out to the valet. I started the long drive back to Scottsdale right then and there. Have you ever driven 4 hours through a barren, featureless desert highway, knowing, with absolute certainty, that you are driving toward an apocalyptic-level neighborhood dispute that you personally caused? It is a ride, honestly. I was blasting the radio, drumming my hands on the steering wheel, just grinning like an absolute psychopath the entire way. I rolled into the sun-kissed Meadows subdivision around 3 in the afternoon on Sunday. The neighborhood was an absolute zoo. It looked like a crime scene. There were cars parked haphazardly up and down the street, half up on the curbs, blocking driveways. People were wandering around the sidewalks holding their cell phones up, walking toward the clubhouse like it was a UFO crash site. I parked my sedan in my driveway, grabbed my duffel bag out of the trunk, and unlocked my front door. The second I stepped inside my house, it hit me. A wall of aggressively frigid, perfectly circulated air. It was a literal meat locker. I dropped my bag and looked at the digital thermostat on the hallway wall. It read 58 degrees. The massive dairy chiller was humming away in the backyard, just absolutely chewing through the Arizona heat like it was nothing, completely unbothered by the fact that it was 115 degrees outside. I was shivering in my shorts and t-shirt within 10 seconds, and I loved every single second of it. I went straight to the hall closet, pushed past my lightweight summer jackets, and pulled out my heavy winter parka, the dark blue goose-down one that I hadn't worn since a ski trip to Colorado 3 years ago. I pulled it on and zipped it all the way up to my chin. Then, because I am nothing if not dedicated to the bit, I went into the kitchen, turned on the stove, boiled some water, and made a full thermos of hot cocoa. I even added the little dehydrated mini marshmallows. I walked out my back door, stepped onto my concrete patio, and walked up to the 6-foot cinder block wall that separated my property from the community pool deck. I peeked over the top of the blocks. It was majestic. It was honestly the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. The entire 50,000-gallon pool was a solid, unbroken, perfectly smooth slab of blue ice. The brutal desert sun was beating down on it with everything it had, but the water was so deeply, fundamentally frozen that it wasn't even melting. The massive chiller in my yard was relentlessly pumping sub-zero glycol continuously through the shared bypass line, creating a localized, unbreakable Arctic vortex. There were about 30 neighbors standing around the wrought iron perimeter fence of the pool, just staring at it in total, bewildered silence. The Jenkins kids, those two terrifying little menaces, were standing at the edge of the deep end. One of them had found a heavy, decorative river rock from the landscaping and hurled it onto the ice. The rock just bounced. It literally bounced, skittered across the surface, and stopped in the middle of the pool. And right there in the middle of the crowd, hyperventilating into a cell phone, was Brenda. "I need an officer here immediately!" She was screaming into her phone, clutching her pastel pink visor with her free hand. "Yes, it is a property emergency. It's an environmental disaster. He broke the pool. He broke the water. Send someone right now!" I took a slow sip of my hot cocoa. The marshmallows were melting perfectly. I decided it was time to close the loop and make my grand entrance. I walked around the side of my house, through my front gate, and strolled casually down the melting sidewalk toward the clubhouse. I was wearing a thick winter parka, a beanie, and holding a steaming thermos, walking through 115-degree heat. As I approached the crowd, people turned and looked at me. The crowd literally parted for me like I was Moses at the Red Sea. Everyone just stared, their brains totally unable to process the visual of a guy in winter gear in the middle of a desert heat wave. "Jack!" Brenda shrieked, spotting me through the crowd. She dropped her phone into her tote bag and literally ran at me. "Turn it off! Turn that monstrous machine off right now!" "Turn what off, Brenda?" I asked mildly, taking another deliberate sip of my cocoa. "I'm just out here enjoying a crisp, refreshing Sunday afternoon. Honestly, I think it's a little chilly out here today. Anybody else cold?" "You froze the pool!" She pointed a violently shaking finger at the frozen wasteland behind her. "You cracked the filtration pipes. The whole community system is a block of solid ice. You are paying for this, Jack. You are going to jail." Right on cue, a white Scottsdale Police Department SUV rolled up to the red curb, lights flashing lazily. Out stepped Officer Martinez. Like I said, he was a younger guy, but within 5 seconds of stepping out of his deeply air-conditioned cruiser, his dark uniform was already starting to stick to his back. He walked heavily up to the crowd, looked at me standing there in my parka, looked at Brenda who looked like she was about to suffer a massive aneurysm, and then looked past us, through the wrought iron fence to the pool. He stopped walking. He took off his polarized sunglasses. He blinked rapidly a few times. Is that ice?" Officer Martinez asked, his voice totally flat, pointing toward the deep end where the Jenkins kid was now trying to slide a plastic patio chair across the surface. "Yes, it's ice," Brenda yelled, stomping her foot. "This maniac did it. He bought some kind of illegal industrial factory machine and he pumped Freon into the community water supply. Arrest him for terrorism. Put him in cuffs." Martinez slowly turned his head to look at me, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "So, let me get this straight, Jack," he said, sounding exhausted. "You're telling me that your air conditioner did this?" "Correction, officer," I said, putting on my best, most cooperative citizen voice. My liquid temperature regulation device experienced a slight thermal anomaly while I was fulfilling my Section 9 obligations to circulate the community water feature. It's a mechanical issue, really. Highly tragic. Martinez stared at me. "Your Section 9 obligations?" I reached into the massive front pocket of my parka. I had brought the prop. I pulled out the thick, 300-page sun-kissed Meadows HOA rulebook. I had tabbed the specific pages with bright yellow sticky notes. I flipped it open to page 142 and handed the heavy binder to the cop. "You see, officer," I said, gesturing with my thermos as if I were giving a lecture. "A few days ago, Brenda here, acting in her official capacity, fined me $500 a day for having a window AC unit. Very tragic, but rules are rules. So I complied. I removed the unit. However, the heat inside my home became life-threatening. So I consulted the rules, specifically Section 8.4, which permits ground-mounted liquid temperature regulation devices. Martinez looked down at the highlighted text in the book. Then he looked at Brenda. "Is that true, ma'am?" "He installed a commercial dairy chiller," Brenda screamed, her voice cracking. "A factory machine. It's not a pool heater. It's a monstrosity. The CCNRs do not specify residential or commercial grade, Brenda," I reminded her gently, smiling. "They just say liquid temperature regulation device. And you personally signed the architectural approval form for the privacy screen covering it. I have the carbon copy right here in my pocket." Martinez was visibly struggling to keep a straight face. He wiped his mouth, looking back at the rulebook. "Okay, fine. But why is the pool frozen, Jack?" "Ah," I said, holding up a finger. "That brings us directly to Section 9. Please flip to the next tab, officer. Properties immediately abutting the Community Amenity Center must maintain and not obstruct any shared utility lines, drainage lines, or water circulation bypass lines present on their lot. Officer, there is a physical bypass line on my property. My chiller requires a massive thermal load dump to prevent the dual compressors from exploding. If I didn't utilize that shared bypass line, the machine would break, voiding my commercial warranty under the federal Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act." I paused for dramatic effect, letting the dense legal jargon just wash over the silent, sweating crowd of neighbors. "Therefore," I concluded, taking a step forward, "I was legally mandated by the HOA bylaws to hook my system into the pool's circulation line. I went to Vegas for the weekend. The machine simply did what the HOA required it to do. It circulated the water. The fact that the water is now a solid block of ice is a civil dispute regarding thermal output limits, not a criminal matter of vandalism." Officer Martinez closed the heavy black rulebook. He handed it back to me. He looked over at the ice rink. He looked down at Brenda. And then he let out a long, slow, incredibly deep sigh. It was the sigh of a man who does not get paid nearly enough by the city to deal with wealthy suburbanites weaponizing their own community guidelines. "Ma'am," Martinez said to Brenda, his tone completely deadpan, "he's right." "He's right?" Brenda shrieked, taking a step toward the cop. "He destroyed $50,000 worth of plumbing infrastructure. The pipes are cracked." "He didn't break a single criminal law," Martinez said, shrugging his shoulders heavily. "He built a fence that you approved to hide a machine that your rules allow, and plugged it into a pipe that your bylaws mandated he maintain. This is entirely a civil dispute. You're going to have to take it up with the HOA board and your commercial insurance company. I cannot arrest a man for following your own rules too well." But, Brenda stammered, her face twisting in pure agony, pointing blindly at the frozen bird resting on the ice. "It's a dairy chiller. He's freezing milk." "Have a good afternoon, folks," Martinez said, turning around and walking back to his cruiser. "Try to stay cool." He got in, shut the heavy door, and drove away, leaving Brenda standing on the sidewalk, completely legally defenseless. The silence that fell over the amenity center after the police cruiser turned the corner was beautiful. It was the sound of absolute, crushing, bureaucratic defeat. Brenda just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating guppy, staring at the frozen pool. I took one last long sip of my cocoa, gave the crowd of shocked neighbors a polite little nod, and turned around. "Well," I said loudly, projecting my voice so everyone could hear, "I should probably go inside. It's getting a little frosty out here. Catch a cold." I walked back down the sidewalk, went through my front door, stepped into my perfectly chilled 58-degree living room, and locked the deadbolt. I threw my parka onto the couch and fell backward onto the cushions. It was, without a doubt, The most satisfying nap I have ever taken in my entire life. But I knew Brenda wasn't going to just let this go. You don't just freeze an entire community pool solid, humiliate the HOA president in front of a cop, and expect her to go quietly into the desert night. The official summons arrived tightly taped to my front door on Tuesday morning. It wasn't a cute, laminated pink slip this time. It was a highly formal, legally drafted notice of an emergency HOA board hearing, scheduled for Thursday night at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. The list of charges printed on the paper was extensive and frankly hilarious. Destruction of community property, unauthorized industrial zoning violations, reckless endangerment of property values, and willful sabotage of shared amenities. They were demanding that I pay $15,000 to unfreeze the pool, repair the cracked PVC circulation pipes, replace the plastic skimmer baskets that had shattered from the ice expansion, and immediately remove the commercial dairy chiller from my property. Failure to comply within 48 hours would result in a hard lien being placed on my deed. I mean, honestly, $15,000 was a steep price to pay for a cold house, but I wasn't going to pay a single dime. I had the entire week to prepare my defense, and I am incredibly good at paperwork. Thursday night arrived. The heat wave was finally starting to break, dropping to a manageable 100 degrees, but the clubhouse was packed. Like, standing room only, fire code violating packed. People had brought folding lawn chairs from their garages. Some people literally brought Tupperware containers of popcorn. The entire neighborhood was treating this meeting like it was the season finale of a prestige HBO drama. I walked to the front of the room and took my seat at a small, cheap folding table facing the raised wooden dais where the 5 HOA board members sat. Brenda was seated dead center, flanked by the treasurer, the secretary, and 2 other guys who looked like they were just there because their wives made them volunteer for the board. Sitting directly next to Brenda was a guy in a cheap, poorly fitting gray suit. He was the HOA's retained legal counsel. Let's call him Mr. Abernathy. Brenda picked up a wooden gavel. She had literally gone out and bought a gavel just for this meeting. She slammed it down on the table, the sharp crack echoing through the silent room. "This emergency board hearing is now in session," Brenda announced, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "We are here tonight to address the egregious, malicious, and catastrophic actions of Jack, who intentionally and with malice aforethought destroyed the sun-kissed Meadows community pool." She immediately turned the floor over to Mr. Abernathy, who stood up, adjusted his tie, and started reading from a massive stack of printed papers. He was going for the throat. He cited the extensive water damage. He cited the cost of emergency plumbers. He talked for 10 solid minutes about how a residential subdivision is absolutely not zoned for agricultural milk-chilling equipment. He laid it on incredibly thick, painting me as a rogue, unhinged mad scientist who weaponized a legal loophole just to destroy a beloved community asset out of pure spite. When he finally finished his monologue and sat down, Brenda looked down at me from the dais with a smug, victorious, terrifyingly confident sneer. "Jack," Brenda said, leaning into her microphone, "you have the floor. Although I highly recommend you just write the $15,000 check right now and save us all the time of listening to your excuses." I stood up slowly. I wasn't wearing a parka this time. I was wearing a very nice, casually tailored button-down shirt and dress slacks. I looked like a guy who was about to close a corporate merger. I walked over to the board's elevated table and handed each of the 5 members, including Mr. Abernathy, a neatly bound 30-page legal dossier I had printed out and spiral-bound at FedEx that afternoon. "Thank you, Brenda. And thank you, members of the board, for having me," I started, projecting my voice clearly so the people standing in the back by the doors could hear every word. "I want to start by saying I am deeply, profoundly saddened by the current state of our beautiful community pool. It is a tragedy, a frozen, solid, tragic block of ice. However, I am not financially, legally, or morally responsible for it." Mr. Abernathy scoffed loudly into his microphone. "You pumped sub-zero industrial glycol into the shared circulation system, Jack. You are entirely responsible." "Actually, counsel," I said, opening my own copy of the dossier and resting it on my folding table. "Let's review the timeline of facts. Tab 1, please." I waited while 5 sets of hands reluctantly flipped open their binders to the first tab. 3 weeks ago, I was aggressively cited by Brenda for a Section 4.2.1 violation, a window air conditioning unit. I was threatened with a financially ruinous $500 daily fine. I did not argue. I complied. I removed the unit immediately. Tab 2. I waited for the rustle of heavy paper. Seeking a legal, compliant alternative method to prevent myself from dying of heat stroke in my own home, I consulted Section 8.4 of our own CCNRs. It states, clearly and without ambiguity, that exterior water temperature regulation devices are permitted. It does not stipulate residential or commercial grade. It does not put a cap on BTUs, tonnage, or thermal output. It simply states the device must be ground-mounted and obscured by a privacy screen. Which brings us to Tab 3. I pointed my index finger right at Brenda's face. Tab 3 is a copy of the architectural approval form, signed in ink and formally stamped by Brenda herself, explicitly approving the privacy screen for my, quote, liquid temperature regulation device. By signing this form, the HOA formally, legally acknowledged and authorized the installation of the equipment under the doctrine of estoppel. You cannot approve a device and then fine me for possessing it. "I thought you were building a koi pond," Brenda yelled, slamming her hand on the table, her face flushing red again. "You didn't ask, Brenda," I replied calmly, never breaking eye contact. "And the CCNRs do not require me to specify my landscaping intentions to you." Now Tab 4. This is where it gets incredibly fun. Mr. Abernathy was looking very closely at Tab 4. He stopped scoffing. His brow furrowed. Tab 4 is Section 9 of our bylaws, the Community Amenity Integration Clause. It explicitly, legally mandates that residents abutting the pool must maintain and not obstruct shared circulation bypass lines. It goes further to state, in plain English, that we must assist in the circulation if the line is present on our deeded property. When my liquid temperature device required a thermal exhaust dump to operate safely, I was legally obligated by your rules to utilize that exact bypass line. If I had dumped the exhaust anywhere else, I would have been in direct violation of Section 9. "This is ridiculous," Brenda shrieked into the microphone. "You used a typo in the rules to freeze the pool out of pure spite." "Spite is subjective, Brenda. The law is objective," I said, leaning forward and resting my knuckles on the table. "And let's talk about federal law, shall we? Tab 5. The Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act." Mr. Abernathy actually winced when I said the name of the act. He was a lawyer. He knew exactly where this train was heading, and he knew he was tied to the tracks. My agricultural dairy chiller came with a very strict, highly regulated commercial warranty, I explained to the silent crowd. If I tamper with the factory thermal dump settings, or if I prevent the machine from naturally displacing its excess energy, the dual compressors will blow, and the warranty is entirely voided. Under the Federal Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act of 1975, a localized HOA bylaw cannot force a consumer to alter a product in a way that voids a federally protected warranty. Because your bylaws required me to use the shared line, and because my warranty required the machine to dump its thermal load, the freezing of the pool was not an act of vandalism. It was a mechanical, legally mandated necessity. I closed my spiral-bound binder with a sharp, decisive snap. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning vents blowing. "So," I concluded, looking directly at Mr. Abernathy, "under the doctrine of estoppel, your president approved the machine. Under Section 9, your bylaws forced me to hook it up to the pool, and under federal law, I couldn't turn the safety limits on the machine off. I followed every single rule you wrote, exactly as you wrote it. If the pool froze, it is because your CCNRs are poorly drafted. Therefore, not only am I refusing to pay the $15,000 for the repairs, but if you attempt to place a lien on my deed, I will countersue this board for harassment, selective enforcement, and all associated legal fees. I sat back down in my folding chair and crossed my arms. Brenda looked frantically at Mr. Abernathy. "Tell him he's wrong," she hissed, grabbing his sleeve. "Tell him we're putting the lien on his house right now." Mr. Abernathy slowly closed his binder. He leaned over, covering his microphone with his hand, but the clubhouse was so dead silent we could all hear him anyway. "Brenda," the lawyer whispered, his voice tight with panic. "He's got us. The language in Section 9 is an absolute disaster. If we take this to civil court, any judge in the county is going to look at the approval form you signed and throw the case out with prejudice. He's weaponized the CCNRs perfectly. Drop the fines. We'll have to pay for the pool repairs out of the HOA Emergency Reserve Fund." "No," Brenda shrieked, completely forgetting to cover the microphone. "He is not getting away with this. He froze the bird." "Brenda," Mr. Abernathy said firmly, his voice echoing loudly over the PA system. "If you pursue this, he will sue the HOA, and he will win. And when this neighborhood finds out you drained the community legal fund fighting a lost cause because you were too stubborn to let a guy have a window AC unit during a historic heat wave, they will recall you as president by Tuesday morning." That did it. The absolute threat of losing her tiny, manufactured shred of suburban power was the only thing in the world that could pierce Brenda's armor. She looked out at the crowd. The neighbors were murmuring. A few of them were openly glaring at her. Greg was actually shaking his head in disgust. She picked up her wooden gavel. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "The board," Brenda choked out, looking like she was actively swallowing a handful of broken glass. "The board will withdraw the fines. The HOA will cover the pool repairs from the Emergency Reserve Fund. This hearing is adjourned." She slammed the gavel down, stood up so fast her chair fell over backward, and practically ran out the side door of the clubhouse. The room erupted. Half the neighborhood was cheering. The other half was just laughing in absolute disbelief. Dave the pipe fitter was standing in the back row. He held up a plastic cup of beer and gave me a slow, respectful salute. And that is exactly how sovereign ruling operates. You don't fight the rules. You embrace the rules. You follow them so deeply, so literally, and so maliciously that the people who wrote them in the first place get down on their knees and beg you to stop. I walked home that night under the warm, beautiful Arizona stars. I opened my front door and stepped into my perfectly chilled 60-degree sanctuary. I didn't even have to turn the lights on to know I had won. I could feel it in the freezing air. I'm Jack. And until the HOA hires a team of very expensive corporate lawyers to completely rewrite all 300 pages of their CCNRs, I'll be sitting right here on my couch, wearing a beanie in July, letting the dairy chiller do its thing. Stay frosty out there.